All right. So type 1 and type 2 error is what we got to learn what those things are today. And part of it's by just trying to work with it. Now, again, thing to remember when we talk about this is error means a slightly different thing when we talk about it in a stats class than it does elsewhere. So elsewhere we've used this term error. Usually it's somebody screwed up. In statistics, it's the price of doing business because we're taking a shortcut. Basically, we're going to try to tell something about a very large group of people, places, or things, population, by looking at a quite small, relatively speaking, group of people, places, or things in the sample. And that sample might be exactly what's going on in the population. That's probably going to be a little bit off. And that little bit off is called error, just in general. And so type 1, type 2 error are these kinds of errors that can happen in a hypothesis test just because we're taking only a sample and not actually looking at the whole population. We never know what's going on in the whole population. What we know is we have a hypothesis, what we think is going on in the population, a null hypothesis. Another hypothesis that we think we might be able to prove with the data. And then either the data proves it or doesn't. But even after we've done that, we don't know for sure what's actually going on in reality. We just know what the data points to. And there's a couple of ways that could err. The first type of error is if the data says to reject the null hypothesis, I shouldn't put that parentheses there, even though okay? So in other words, we go through a test and by luck, call it good luck or bad luck, we get data that is quite far from the null hypothesis mean or the null hypothesis proportion. And that leads us to reject the null hypothesis. Underlying it, unbeknownst to us, the null hypothesis is true. Now, we don't get to know whether we've actually made a type 1 error. But acknowledging that it's something that could happen is an important item. In fact, the way we set up a hypothesis test is that the probability of a type 1 error given that H naught is true is that alpha, that level of the test. So that alpha we set, that's the chance that even with a good null hypothesis, a true null hypothesis, we're going to reject it because our data is different. Why is our data different? Chance. 5% chance usually, if we have a 5% alpha, that the data is going to lead us to reject the null hypothesis even though it's true. So that's one way. The other way is a failure to reject. and that's a type 2. And there is, and I don't know if your textbook goes over this or not, we will not be paying much attention to it. Okay? Because it's just a bit much to deal with right now. But there is such thing as a probability of type 2 error. Of course, it's kind of hard to say because we don't think of it that way, because then if it's type 2, all we know is what the hypothesis isn't. We can make up a specific alternative and come up with a probability of type 2 error. And then with that, we can also, by subtracting 1 from that, come up with a probability that is called the power of the test, the power against a certain alternative. So those are terms that kind of are going to be, you may see them, but they are beyond the scope of this, okay? But knowing what a type 2 error is and knowing that it's one of the possibilities is not. So there's really four possibilities you can think of. One, you reject the null hypothesis, and in fact, unbeknownst to you, the null hypothesis is false. That's not error. Second possibility, you can fail to reject the null hypothesis, and in fact, the null hypothesis is true. No error there either. And then the other two possibilities are you can reject the null hypothesis even though it's true. That's called type 1 error. So type 1 error always involves a rejection. That's just rejection when it's not true. Type 2 involves failing to reject, even though I won't say you should have, because the only evidence we have is the data, and the data says what the data says. But you're failing to reject when, in fact, unbeknownst to you, H naught really is false. Okay. With that in mind, let's go over some of the questions that are coming up here. Mean price of mid-sized cars. I'm going to go through some odd ones, and then you guys have the even ones for your homework. Mean price of mid-sized cars is $32,000. Test is conducted to see if the claim is true. State the type 1 and type 2 errors in complete sentences. So our null hypothesis in that case mean price of cars is, oopsie, wrong screen, right screen, 32,000. Okay, that is our null hypothesis. And as far as we know, our only alternative is the mean price is not 32,000. Okay, so there's our mean. We could even go with mu equals 32,000 versus mu not equal 32,000. We could have gone there. Okay. So our type 1 error okay, and so the first thing we think of, okay, what does that mean? Rejecting a true null hypothesis. Rejecting the null hypothesis even though it is true. So what does that mean? It means that the reality is what? In terms of the price of cars. The mean is 32,000. But we conclude what? That it's not. Okay, type 2 error. Again, my first thought is to say, what is type 2 error again? Oh, it's not rejecting a false null hypothesis. Okay, false null hypothesis. So what is the reality? Mean is not the data, but the underlying reality. What is going on? The null hypothesis is false, which means what? Is 32,000 or is not? That's the null hypothesis. But if the null hypothesis is false, right? Means it's not. That's the reality. Mean is not 32,000, but we conclude the mean is 32,000. Okay. Best way to think of it is, first of all, write what a type 1 or type 2 error is, theoretically, but that definition, just like I did, and then go immediately after it to saying, okay, what's the reality? You know, you're either the null hypothesis is true, the null hypothesis is false, and what does that mean in plain English? But you've rejected it. What does that say about your conclusion? Okay. So this was problem 11. Okay. Let's go to 13. Oh, they do actually expose you to this. Skip number 14 on your homework, and I will skip number 13. Skip number 14. Okay. Group of doctors deciding whether or not to perform an operation. Suppose the null hypothesis is procedure will go well. So let's go down to 15 here. Our null hypothesis is procedure will go well. So just for our sake, what would the alternative then be? Procedure will not go well. Okay. And so then we are asked to find type 1 and type 2 error. And so my first thing is to state the definition. That definition is rejecting H naught even though it is true. And writing it in English, I think it is a little bit easier to write the reality first and then write your conclusion. So, if the null hypothesis is true, because that's what type 1 error is, it's doing something when the null hypothesis is true. If the null hypothesis is true, what is the reality? procedure will go well or the procedure goes well. Now we'll say will, because, okay. But we conclude, what do we conclude? That it will not. Okay, that's the type 1 error. Type 2 error. So I think about, okay, what is the definition of a type 2 error again? Oh, it is not rejecting when it is false. Okay, so let's think of the reality. If H naught is false, what is the reality? Procedure does not go well. Procedure will not go well. But we conclude that what? It will go well. Okay? Let's inspect 17. Seventeen's not good because it goes on. By the way, the answer I can just mention is 1 minus this. But this is kind of an incomplete question because we don't talk about the power of a test in general. We talk about the power of a test against a specific alternative usually. Okay? Again, 19 is about power. So let me edit your assignment right now. So you've got enough to do what I want you to do right now for section 9.2. We know what type 1 error is. We know what type 2 error is. We're not going to worry as much about actually calculating power. Okay? So number 12, you should be able to do. Number 14, I've told you to skip. Number 16, I want you to think about and write an answer for. Number 18, you can do. Number 20, I want you to think about and write your answer. Okay? So there you have it. So the rest of the time we're doing 9.1 and 9.2 homework as needed, submitting them, getting them done, and realizing it's going to be a long time before we look at statistics again. Well, relatively long time. Till Wednesday. All right. Thanks.